Welcome back to One Mind Syndicate. I am your host, Gersh1, and today we're going to be doing something a little different today. We're going to be going over 4 different creepypasta stories based in the Warhammer 40K universe. If you're new to the channel, subscribe. We post Warhammer 40K lore videos every single day. If you guys have suggestions for anything about Warhammer 40K that you guys would like us to talk about, please comment down below. And if you enjoy this type of content, it is because of our patrons on Patreon. If you guys want to support us, please visit the link down in the description below. But with that said, let's get into the very first story, titled The Cocoon. On the planet of Arbor, in the Segmentum Ultima, the Imperium was ready to fight a desperate war against the planetary governor and what was assumed to be a rogue separatist group. The conflict began when the planet failed to send in their military tithes, when ambassadors to the Administratum failed to respond to astropathic messages about the issue. The Imperium sent in the Imperial Guard. Knowing that the Planetary Defense Force would put up some resistance, the Imperium expected a few skirmishes once they attempted to capture the key hive cities of the planet. Little did they know that the planetary governor had been fortifying the hive cities for the past couple years. Each hive city was enclosed in an indestructible cocoon-like structure, nothing that even the Adeptus Mechanicus had ever seen. When bombing runs on the large structure proved ineffective, guardsmen were sent in to find a kink along the outer border of the structure. The regiments were surprised to find no resistance from the inhabitants, not a single glimpse of movement outside of the hive cities. Many of the sergeants were expecting ambush attacks, and their men were ordered to be on high alert for any sudden surprise attack. Throughout the entire process, guardsmen were on edge, waiting for the sound of gunfire to erupt at any moment, but there was complete silence. Then suddenly, to the surprise relief of everyone, the sound of gunfire. Units mobilized and sped towards the conflict. Vox communication went wild with inquiries of the situation. But just as quickly as the sound was heard, the commotion stopped. It was a case of friendly fire, as one unit mistook another for the enemy. An enemy that seemed nowhere to be found. As the first day came to a close, the night sky was lit up with flashes as the demolition teams detonated their charges along the edge of the structure, where the gates to the hive city used to be. Guardsmen watched the impressive show as they settled into this extremely strange situation. They were trained to be prepared for the initial assault as the most bloody, but this was the exact opposite. Everyone felt that the enemy was watching and waiting for the right moment to attack. All they could do is sink in deeper into what seemed like a trap. Captains began to speculate about the situation. One claimed that the Eldar were the culprits behind this whole thing. He shared his story on the moon of Tamner, when an Eldar pirate ship disabled their space station. The Xeno scum watched as the entire crew hopelessly starved to death. Not a single shot was fired. They simply watched as one by one they died. Another captain pointed towards the ground. He explained he had heard of whole planets covered in underground cities. This could be one of them. The Separatists were counting on them to focus on the giant structures, only to come from underneath and kill them all. As the speculation continued, orders came to set up camp miles away from the hive city. Each regiment was to bombard the structure with artillery fire every hour on the hour until the shell cracked. After a 5-day barrage campaign, the Imperium called down the Adeptus Mechanicus to use their arcane sorcery to scan the massive structure. Something this strong would be of extreme value to the Imperium, and only the tech priests would be able to validate such a discovery. Miraculously, the scans taken of the structure picked up sounds coming from within the hive cities, the voices of billions of traders that inhabited the city. Quickly, the commander ordered the voices deciphered. These voices would shed light on the plot that was to unfold. The Adeptus Mechanicus worked on separating all of the gargled voices. The Imperial Guard watched as serval skull after serval skull buzzed around the enormous structure. They couldn't help but feel uneased by the tech priest's unusual appearance, their grotesque augmentations as alien as any spacefaring Xenos. After a while, the commander was called to the tech priest's tent, where the deciphering process was about to be complete. As the commander entered, he heard the voice.
Pomos nam, pomos nam.
He stood over the tech priest as the voice continued on a loop. The commander could not understand. This was not a tongue he was familiar with. The tech priest explained that no one knew what language this was. It wasn't even a deviation from Low Gothic like most planets tend to create. His team was running the voice through the Imperial language catalogs. The commander asks if that's why the voice was running in a loop. The tech priest shook his head. They weren't looping the voice. The person was simply repeating the same thing over and over again.
Pomos nam, pomos nam.
As everyone in the tent stood listening to the eerie voice, a cogitator began to buzz, and the tech priest was able to pull up another voice.
Pomos nam, pomos nam.
The same thing, repeated over and over. The tech priest ordered his men to search through the garbled voices and find every time the phrase pomos nam was used. Within seconds, the cognitators began to ring with hundreds of hits. The commander asked if people inside the city were chanting the same phrase. The tech priest didn't believe so. If they were, there would be a rhythm to the massive jumble of voices, but there wasn't.
Pomos nam, pomos nam.
The tech priest ordered the scans to stop on the city. They were to visit another structure. Perhaps things would get clearer if they gathered more data. The commander could do nothing more than to continue his attempted siege of the city. Eventually, the tech priest was able to decipher one more phrase.
Nisi nos.
And much like the first, it was repeated over and over in an unidentified language. Days turned into weeks and no progress of any kind. The commander began prepping his request for an orbital bombardment on the planet. Suddenly, a crack appeared down the side of one of the structures. The Imperial Guard rushed into action and bombarded the Legion with every warhead at their disposal. Like a giant eggshell, the structure began to crumble and fall. The smoke and debris sent up a giant cloud in the air. When the smoke cleared, the guardsmen were confronted by a gruesome image. An enormous conglomeration of flesh, hair, and bone, covering what used to be the hive city. Like a giant fleshy mold growing and pulsating on a mountain of metal. With no barrier to cover the city, the sound captured by the scanners could now be heard by everyone. The cries of millions of people as they moaned in agony. Millions of naked humans being conjoined at various points to one another. Some lifeless, others looking out towards the guardsmen in distress. A mucous membrane running through the entire mass like an acidic glue fusing the bodies together, some of them women and children. Every guardsman stood in shock, unable to process the atrocity they saw before them. To everyone's horror, the blob began to move. What appeared to be two massive shoulders slowly gave rise to a humanoid head. The head turned its grotesque visage towards the guardsmen. The human bodies that made up the demon's skin squirmed as each movement brought them pain. With a hellish grin, the demon began to move towards the men. Fire rang out as ballistic missiles were launched towards the beast. The missiles that made their target left enormous holes in the monster. The creature's insides were also made up of human bodies. With every blast, hundreds of former city dwellers died. But their lives meant nothing to the guardsmen who only saw this demonic creature. The demon pulled his head back and then spit out a giant ball of mucus. As soon as the slime made contact with the guardsman, it began to steam as it melted through flak armor and metal. Giant acid-spitting demons made up of living human bodies. They were all reported over the Vox communicators as the commander realized that all the hive cities on the planet were birthing these same demons. A total of 6 structures all cracked open and outpoured these behemoths from hell. Years earlier, the planetary governor had made a deal with a rogue psyker. In exchange for the psyker's freedom, he would gift the planetary governor 6 powerful elixirs, one for each one of his hive cities. These elixirs would allow the drinker to live 1,000,000 lives. Unbeknownst to the planetary governor, the psyker was possessed by a demon of Nurgle, and believing the elixirs would grant immortality to him and his family, the governor accepted. The psyker taught the governor how to create a sacred paper-thin cloth that was to be used to build giant canopies over each hive city. The demon instructed the governor that once the canopies were complete and the hive cities shielded from all light, each family member was to consume the elixir at a separate hive city. Upon consumption, the royal family fell over in pain as their skins began to peel. Horribly disfigured, the royal family members were sequestered in their rooms, afraid to show their disfigured skin. Servants began to report that the royal family began to secrete steam. Every time their chamber door was open, steam would roll out into the palaces. Soon each palace and each hive city was filled with a smog that was so thick servants could not see 5 feet in front of them. Embarrassed and ashamed, the planetary governor remained hidden in his palace. Eventually the steam began to roll out even further and get captured by the giant canopies that covered each city. Within 2 weeks, the hive cities were enveloped inside giant steam chambers. During this time, each individual who drank from the elixir began to hear voices. The voices told them they were dying and that the only way to live was to take the lives of their servants. These voices were Nurgle himself, and it was only a matter of time before every family member succumbed to Grandfather Nurgle's embrace. When the citizens began to attempt to pull down the canopy to release some of the steam, they realized it would not tear. Try as they might, the canopy was indestructible, and it soon began to harden. Communication from city to city became impossible, and astropathic signals never returned. Within a month, hysteria began to sink into the populace of each city. The population felt trapped in a giant steam-filled nightmare. An imperial noble gathered a small force of men to storm the governor's palace and take justice for their predicament. But what they found inside the palace horrified them. After breaking down the palace gates, the group was attacked by an abomination. It was the governor, who had fused himself with all of the servants inside his palace and was now controlling them like some sort of exoskeleton. It seemed that whenever the exoskeleton would make contact with any flesh, it would absorb it, sticking to the major body. Using the steam as his cover, the governor added human after human to his growing body. While each individual captured remained conscious and retained their senses, the captured were devoid of all voluntary movement. They were puppets to the royal family. What the Imperial Guard was fighting was the entire population of each hive city, controlled by the individual whom drank from the elixir. Battle against these creatures continued. Communication from the 129th Regiment ceased, and soon the 34th Regiment reported a second demon rushing their flanks. Within minutes, the 34th and the 129th were completely gone. Realizing that these demons were going to overrun his army, the commander ordered a full retreat into the transportation vehicles. As soon as he would make it back to his ship, the order to blow up the planet to hell would be made. The few ships ready to depart did so without hesitation. Unfortunately, they were struck out of the air by the demon's swinging arms. Escape from the planet would be almost impossible. Watching the transport ships crash down in a giant cloud of smoke, the tech priests in charge of deciphering the voices entered in a series of extreme evasive protocols into the minds of his drivers and launched into the air. The escaping tech priest was able to evade the swinging arms of the demon, but the demon leapt up into the air and caught the ship with its hands. The bodies scraped up against the ship door and tore one open. The bodies screamed as they shifted to fit inside the ship's corridors. A few servitors were caught and fused with the rolling mass of screaming human bodies as they pushed their way into the ship. The servitors turned on the crew and began to attack, now under the control of the demon. The tech priest ordered his pilots to ignite the thruster rockets to break free from the demon's grasp. Upon ignition, the demon's arms were sliced and the ship flew away. The remains of his body continued to fight on in the ship, as more and more of the crew was captured by the demon. The tech priest realized that the demon was still a threat, as it consumed more and more of his crew. He sealed the cockpit doors and ordered all other doors in the ship opened. He was going to expose the demon to the harshness of space. Once the transport ship exited the planet's atmosphere, the demon slowed down, and its body stopped screaming as the individual bodies froze. On the planet, the demon that was chasing the tech priest and whose arms were severed suddenly crashed down. It now appeared to be a gigantic mass of human remains, stretched around what was once the Imperial Guard base. It seemed that whoever was controlling the demon was now dead, and along with his death, the control over the citizens was gone. A pile of human carcasses, covered in mucus, some still alive, was left for the retreating Imperial Guardsmen to witness. The poor souls would find the Emperor's mercy soon enough, as the commander's transport ship made it back to the fleet. The remaining 5 demons were obliterated by the orbital bombardment. The survivors were forever scarred by the grotesque experience, but they felt lucky to be alive. The bodies left frozen on the Tech Priest transport ship were taken in by the Inquisition for examination. They found that the body of the governor, who was controlling the giant mass, was never found. The planet was quarantined, and then simply wiped off Imperial maps and records. No one was to speak of the incident. The Tech Priest and Commander were both turned away and disciplined for inquiring about the remains of the hard-shell structure left on the planet. The whole campaign would soon become a myth. And that was the Cocoon. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. This next creepypasta story does not have a title. I just want to jump into it and hope you guys enjoy. Space Station Valentim hovered over the mining world of Divite. It was the only place in the entire Achelan system that harbored human life. I was part of a small team that consisted of 2 AdMech researchers, 6 mining workers, an arbitus, and a newly appointed administratum representative. I was the new guy in the group, the administratum representative. When I was given this assignment, I was told of the privilege such a task was for a young aspirant. The reality was, the mining planet was much too small and pointless to send a full-fledged member of the administratum. And so, I was plucked out of my home and flown into this desolate place. During the journey, I was filled with excitement. I had only met half a dozen people that had left my home planet. This experience was going to allow me to experience things that the majority of my peers would only hear about in stories. I didn't even care about the cramped conditions I had to endure, since I was sent on a cargo transportation ship instead of a regular Imperial ship. Or that the travel made me horribly sick, and I spent the majority of my journey vomiting and seeing strange visions of blue squids swimming through my small cabin. When I arrived on Valentim, the space station doors opened. I was greeted by a pale gray servitor. I introduced myself and walked toward him, expecting him to take my luggage. Without a word, the servitor walked past me and began to unload the cargo. Luckily, no one was around to witness my stupid attempt to talk to a lobotomized servant. The first person I came across was Engineer Ludres. She was one of the AdMech researchers on the space station. She explained Morris, the arbitrator, would have been the only one aware of my arrival. She directed me towards his chamber, where we found him sleeping on a pile of empty beer cans. After waking the arbitrator, she showed me around the space station. I met the majority of the crew, except for 2 miners that were in the lower decks working on retrieving today's mineral extractions. The majority of the crew seemed friendly. The isolation made them very excited about having a new face around the station. All but one worker, Rich, who hadn't said a word. He simply nodded and shook my hand when we introduced. Later on, I pulled Ludres aside and asked why Rich was so standoffish. She explained an accident in the lower decks had occurred. A moving pipe struck him in the neck and nearly killed him. He had trouble speaking, and so he just stopped trying. I asked if anyone else was hurt in the accident, but she simply looked at the arbitrator and moved on with another story. I settled into my new job as a bean counter. I took down and prepared inventory reports on every extraction center the space station visited. The planet was covered in 12 extraction centers. Valentim, the space station, would connect to each one once a day and extract the raw materials to ship out to the neighboring systems. I began to wonder how long this space station had been active. I pulled out the archives of the past inventory reports and found that the planet used to have 13 extraction points. I began to look at the station's history and found that the 13th extraction point was still active no longer than 2 years ago. It seemed very strange to me that the 13th extraction point was no longer used and was not reported to the administratum. It was my job to do so I brought this up to Ludres, and she explained that the extraction point was out of commission. When I asked one of the miners, he acted as if there was only 12 points. The arbitrator explained that the 13th went dry. It seemed no one wanted to give me an explanation of what really happened to the 13th extraction point. I began looking for a map that displayed the location of the mysterious extraction point. I had to find its exact coordinates before I could report it to the administratum. The crew took notice and became hostile towards my work. It made sense. In a way, I was blaming them for not reporting this sooner. The arbitrator finally approached me in the archive room and bluntly told me to stop trying to find the 13th extraction point. This only made me want to find it even more. Months passed, and I was able to locate a coordinate of the location visited by the Valentim twice before. It did not fit any known coordinates, and I figured it must be the 13th point. When the crew was asleep, I entered into the control room and set the coordinate into the automated directional system. The destination was locked, and at 9 o'clock tomorrow, the Valentim would visit what I hoped to be the 13th point. After the last extraction point, the team gathered together in the mess hall for supper. While I ate, I could feel my heart beating out of my chest. I knew the space station was slowly making its way to the new course. I began to question why I was even doing this. If I discovered that the team was smuggling material, would I have the guts to report them? What if the extraction point was damaged, and returning would cause harm to the station? I could be accidentally setting us for a collision course. I cleared my head and reminded myself of the station's safety protocols, and realized we would be fine, and at least I would get my answer. The alarm that normally notifies the crew we were approaching an extraction point began to sound. At this point, only Ludres and I were in the mess hall. When the alarm went off, Ludres looked around and said something was wrong. She left to the control room. I stood up and made my way towards the lower deck. When I reached the lower deck, the doors opened and the station locked to the extraction point platform. Nothing out of the ordinary. The lights turned on and the platform was empty. I stepped out. Complete silence. When I reached the lower decks, the doors opened and the station locked to the extraction point platform. Nothing out of the ordinary. The lights turned on and the platform was empty. I stepped out, and it was completely silent. Suddenly, the sound of clanking came from one of the open extraction holes. The hole was large enough to fall into, so I carefully made my way to look down. I peered down the long shaft, but I saw nothing, and the sound had stopped. "You idiot," the arbitrator said. He was standing in the doorway to the space station. I tried my best not to seem startled as I turned to look at him. He was holding a las gun in his hand. The miners arrived with las pistols in their hands as well. As I was about to start explaining why I had to know what happened to this extraction point, the arbitrator rose his las gun at me and fired. I fell to the floor. As I looked up, I saw the rest of the crew began to fire, but not at me. They were firing at something behind me. I looked back and saw a 7-foot-tall black creature with no eyes or ears. Its body leapt into the air and drove its long tentacle-like arms into the arbitrator's head. The creature pulled back as the other crew members continued to shoot. It dragged the arbitrator's body like a ragdoll, using it as a shield, and then launched it at the group. The arbitrator's body knocked down 2 of the miners, and by the time they hit the floor, the creature was already upon the closest miner, tearing his head from his body in one effortless motion. One of the miners looked up at a security camera and screamed, "Get out of here!" A second later, the creature impaled him with his 2 long tentacle arms. He then split the miner down the middle with its sheer strength. The creature gruesomely dismembered the remaining miners and then entered the space station. The blood and guts of my comrades dripping down its limbs as it walked along the corridors. I laid motionless for a moment, and then I made my way into the space station. I could hear gunfire as Ludres and the other AdMech researcher fought for their lives against the creature. When the gunfire ceased, I could hear someone coming back into the lower chamber. I crawled underneath a desk and pulled a filing cabinet in front of me to hide me from whoever came back to the lower deck. It was the creature. Over its shoulders was Luther, and in its hand was the AdMac researcher's spine, which dragged his head along the floor. It tossed the remains into the center of the lower chamber, and then gathered the other dead crew in the same pile. I was crouched, peering out of the slit created by the cabinet and the desk. My heart was racing, and it was difficult to contain my breath. I was petrified the creature would hear me. I watched as the creature began to consume my crewmates. It took Ludrus's head with 2 hands and shook it. She moaned in pain. She was still alive. I looked over to see if I could reach one of the last pistols on the floor. But my heart sank as I heard the sound of crushing bone. I couldn't bear to watch as the creature ate each crew member. It slurped and gnawed on the remains as if it was its last meal. After a couple of hours, the creature stopped its feast. He picked up a broken bone and began to carve something on the wall of the chamber. It was difficult to see what he was carving because his body covered most of it. When he was finished, he tossed the bone aside and stood in the chamber silently. I looked at what he carved, and to my surprise, it was a phrase. Perhaps it was a warning message to whomever would come investigate what happened. After I read the carving, I couldn't help but begin to cry. The message said, "I see you under the desk." This next story is titled The Agri World. The sun was beginning to set as Miko was returning to his barn atop of his harvester tractor. He looked out at what he believed to be the most beautiful sight, fields upon fields of farmland, gifted to Miko by the God Emperor himself. It was his duty to tend to these fields, and it was a duty he held very dear to his heart. Miko had never seen anything beyond this beautiful agri world, but he knew from what the adepts of the Administratum told him that his work touched the entire Imperium. It had not been easy to farm this land all alone after the cutbacks of labor sanctioned by the Administratum, or the unexpected death of his wife, but Miko had managed to continue to meet the yield requirements for the last 2 years, and he felt confident that with the divine guidance of the God Emperor, he would continue to prosper in the years to come. As Miko parked the tractor and put away all his tools, he was distracted by a small steady stream of smoke coming from across the field. It was the home of his new neighbors. They too were settling in after a day of hard work, or at least that's what he thought. Not all farmers had been so lucky as he was. After the labor cutbacks, his previous neighbors had missed the yearly yield requirements, and they lost their privilege of tending the Emperor's land. Miko wondered what happened to that family. He still remembers the delicious dinner the family had cooked for him, as a thank you for helping them out during the start of the harvest. When Miko returned to give back the plates, their home was empty. The Administratum, or their subordinates, must have picked them up. Wherever they may be, he was sure that the Emperor would watch over them. Having new neighbors meant he had to go introduce himself. If he hurried, he would be able to reach their home right before sundown. He quickly stored away his tools and ordered his harvester servitor to finish its last action and power down for the night. He hopped on his bicycle and headed down the dirt path toward his new neighbor's house. Miko made it just in time. He rode up to the front of the neighbor's house, just as the sun slightly peeked across the horizon. Unfortunately for him, he did not receive the welcome he thought he would. Miko walked up to the house and happily introduced himself to the 2 teenage boys that were sitting in the front porch. Neither of them said a word, they simply just stared. He looked over to the front door and saw a pregnant woman, who he assumed to be the mother of the boys, but she didn't say anything either. She simply locked the door and stood silently. Around the corner of the house came a man, about the same height as Miko and similar build. Miko introduced himself again, and this time the man returned the introduction. Ron was the man's name. He introduced his wife and 2 kids, and thanked Miko for coming by to welcome them. He apologized for his family's apprehension, but he explained that they were simply shy. Miko got a strange vibe from Ron and his family. Ron seemed closed off, not wanting to discuss his previous home or anything about their family's past. He mostly talked about the condition the house was left in and the quality of tools left behind. What Miko found most peculiar was when Ron mentioned he did not have any row covers for next year, and Miko said he had seen some left behind in the barn. The two boys jumped up and ran towards the barn to close the two large doors. Something about mentioning the barn triggered the boys' bizarre actions. What was in that barn, Miko wondered. Whatever it was, Ron knew that the boys' action had alerted Miko, or at least planted a seed of suspicion. By that point, the sun was down, and Ron used that as an excuse to send Miko back to his home. As Miko rode his bike back, he couldn't help but continue looking over his shoulder. The bizarre first impression of the new neighbors was a chilling realization that not everyone held the same devotion to the kindness and duty of the Emperor. As a matter of fact, Miko never once heard Ron thank the Emperor for his new home or farmland. Nevertheless, Miko was happy to be back home, and he stored away his bicycle as his stomach began to growl. He had missed dinner, and the bike ride only added to his hunger. As he walked from the barn to the house, he realized there was movement in the fields. Perhaps a scavenger eating his crops. As he got closer, he realized this was no common pest. Whatever it was much larger. The familiar sound of pistons shooting off was a huge relief to Miko. It was his harvester servitor, still working in the fields. Miko must have forgotten to order him to power off before he left. He approached the servitor and gave the order to finish off whatever it was doing and shut down for the night. The servitor stopped its task, immediately turned around to look at Miko, and retracted its harvester sights. Miko had had enough for the day. He was ready to eat. After a well-deserved meal and a warm bath, Miko was finally in bed. He laid there, thinking about Ron and his family. Perhaps he was over-judgmental of their actions. It had been so long since Miko had socialized with someone new. Ron and his family had every right to be apprehensive to a stranger. Ron was a lucky man to still have his family. Miko began to reminisce of his wife and his hope to be granted permission by the administratum to start a family. He put a lot of hard work into improving his house, making sure it was spacious enough for the big family his wife and him dreamed of. Unfortunately, the Emperor had different plans, and now he went to bed every night, all alone, in a large, empty house. A loud, strange noise came from outside. Miko quickly got out of bed and peered out of his window. He could not see anything out of the ordinary. He had a perfect view of his neighbor's house and barn from the second-story window of his bedroom. Nothing out of the ordinary there either. The home was completely dark, like it should be during this time of night. Suddenly, Miko saw a small light that looked like it was coming from a small candle. It came out of the neighbor's house and into the barn. What reason could there be for something to go into the barn at this time of night? Whatever it was, Miko was going to find out, but he decided his best bet would be to report the strange occurrence to the administratum. There would be no sense in attempting to snoop around his neighbor's home. Miko returned to bed and fell asleep. Miko was awoken by a strange noise coming from outside his home. It sounded like scratching, and he could tell it was coming from the front of the house. It was a sound that he had never heard before, but the longer he listened, the more he could tell it was coming from right his front door. Miko laid in bed, wondering if he should investigate, but suddenly the sound stopped. Perhaps it was the trees in front of his home. Miko tried his best to reason with himself over the strange noise. 15 minutes passed, and Miko was drifting off to sleep. His paranoia would not get the best of him, he thought. The noise returned. Miko laid as silent as possible, slowing down his breath so he could hear the sound better. Shivers ran down his back as he realized the noise was not coming from outside anymore. The sound was coming from down the stairs, near the front of the door. Miko sat up and looked out of his bedroom door into the hallway. The sound continued. Miko slowly stood up and walked to the front of the doorway. He slowly took a step out into the hallway, hoping the floor wouldn't creak. Whoever it was, Miko wanted to take it by surprise. He took another step toward the staircase. He could feel his heartbeat pounding against his chest. Miko froze as he realized the sound was coming from the end of the staircase. Whoever it was coming for him. Miko realized he had no plan or weapon to defend himself. He slowly stepped back into his room and shut the door. He looked around his room and found a tall wooden candle holder. There was no reasonable doubt that whoever was coming for him was right outside his door. 5 minutes passed by, but to Miko it felt like an eternity. He stood in his bedroom staring at the door, waiting for another scratch, but nothing happened. Miko finally gained the courage and spoke out. He said, "Listen, Ron, I apologize if I startled you earlier, but coming into my house without my permission is uncalled for. In the name of the God Emperor, I will report you for your misconduct to the Administratum. Now, unless you want trouble with them, I suggest you open my door, apologize, and return to your home." No response. Another 5 minutes passed in silence. Finally, Miko gathered the courage and reached for the doorknob. He slowly opened the door. Miko was thrown back into his room as the Harvester Servitor barreled into the room. Hissing engines and horrible gurgling noises filled the room as the Servitor shot out its Harvester sights and began to swing at Miko. Miko was able to escape the first swings, but the speed of the Servitor was too much. He was cut on his left shoulder and right thigh. Miko looked for the wooden candle holder, but couldn't find it. It must have rolled underneath his bed. Again, the Servitor swung, and again Miko tried his best to evade, but caught a deep cut across his face. Blood began to drip down his face as he tried his best to fight back the Servitor, but the Harvester Servitor's augmented body was too strong for a human to harm. Miko couldn't comprehend how or why his Servitor was attacking him. Program protocol would never allow a Servitor to attack a human being. Unexpectedly, Miko heard a human scream, and then a pitchfork, coming from the hallway, flew across the room and landed into the Servitor's body. The two neighbor boys ran in with pitchforks in hand and stabbed the stunned Servitor, leaving the farm tools jabbed inside the Servitor's body. They picked up Miko, and all three ran down the stairs and out of the house. Miko's adrenaline allowed him to follow the boys back to their home. When they arrived, they ran into the barn instead of the house. Miko fell over in exhaustion. He could feel the blood running out of his wounds, but the pain was being blocked off by his body's shock response. Miko looked up and saw the neighbor's Servitor tied up and half alive in the corner of the barn. Black ink-looking fluid covered the floor around the tied-up machine. Miko asked the boys if the Servitor had attacked them as well. The two boys looked at each other, and one began to explain that their dad was attacked by the Servitor on their first day at the house. The Servitor refused to follow orders to shut down, and when their father attempted to power it off, the Servitor attacked. Luckily, their dad was able to defend himself and trap the machine. As the boy was finishing up the story, Ron walked into the barn. He looked at Miko and looked at the boys with an angry expression on his face. Miko explained that his Servitor had gone crazy and just attacked him as well. His boys arrived just in time to save him. Miko stood up and explained if it wasn't for his boys, he wouldn't be alive. Ron smiled and walked toward his boys. The boys walked back, trying to keep their distance from Ron. Ron reassured the boys not to be scared and looked at Miko. He said, "These boys saved my life too. They were able to fight off the Servitor." Miko looked at the boys, and the boys looked at their dad. Miko asked why did the boys say that Ron fought the Servitor. There was a tense silence, and Ron said it didn't matter who killed what. The important thing is that the Servitors are now dead, and they can move on with their lives. Miko explained they needed to ride into town and notify the authorities of the malfunctioning Servitors. Ron responded with approval and walked over to Miko. Miko got a weird feeling from the approaching man. He felt uneasy. It could have been the loss of blood, or maybe the adrenaline wearing off, but something pushed Miko to step back from Ron and told him to get away. Ron snarled at the action and looked at his boys. You shouldn't have saved him. Now he's going to be a bigger problem than he should. Ron grabbed a large mallet and ran towards Miko, ready to smash his head in with the weapon. The boys ran and tackled their dad. "Don't kill him, Dad. We don't want any more violence." The boys were able to pin him down, and Miko used the small strength he had to toss a rope over to the boys, which they used to tie him up. "What just happened?" Miko exclaimed to the boys. Just then, the mother came into the barn, holding onto her belly. It startled Miko to see that she didn't look surprised, as someone should they be walking into a room where her tied-up husband and bloodied neighbor would be. She smiled at the boys and said, "Let your father loose. Your brother is very mad at you two," as she rubbed her belly. The mother looked at Miko and said, "My boys haven't told you the truth, because they were scared you might think our family was crazy, and you might hurt us. But no one can hurt us now. Not as long as my baby boy is here. You see, me and my family were blessed. I was given the divine duty of carrying the supreme malevolent master. He is my son, the Lord of the Galaxy, and the one who will cast down the false god. His power is getting stronger and stronger by the day. He was the one that blessed these machines you call servitors with the gift of divine guidance." The mother looked at the boys and said, "I already told you once, let these machines do what your brother has ordered them to do. I am very disappointed in you too. Now I'm not going to ask you again. Free your father and kill this man. Your brother is asking you to do this." Miko realized he was too weak to even try to run away, much less to defend himself from the boys and their father. He looked at the boys and pleaded, "Boys, please do not do what your mother has said. She is not right in her mind. How could you turn away from the light of the Emperor? We could stay calm and get help. Like you said, there shouldn't be any more violence. We will safely restrain her, and no harm will come to anyone here. The proper authorities could handle this." Miko hoped he could reason with the boys. The mother angrily responded, "Do not anger your little brother anymore. If you don't, stop." Miko interrupted. "Boys, your family will be safer if you stop and get help. By the name of the God Emperor, please listen to me. Let him guide you. If you simply..." Miko's body fell to the floor. His crushed skull splattered all over the floor. Parts of his brain still hung from the hands of the harvester servitor standing above him. The machine had snuck up behind him, the pitchfork still stabbed in its body. One of the boys fell to his knees. The other stood in shock. The mother simply smiled and said, "Don't be scared, boys. Your little brother doesn't want to hurt you. Otherwise, he would have sent his servitors after you two. But don't push your luck. Next time, do as I say. Now one of you untie your dad, and the other can untie the other servitor. We don't have to hide him anymore." The mother walked back to the house, with the dark servitor guarding her and his unborn master. And that was the Agri World. I hope you guys enjoyed that one. This next story is titled Wife. I hope you guys enjoy. 2 years had passed since the death of my wife. She was taken from me by the ruinous powers, tempted by the slick tongue of a heretic disguised as a traveling salesman. She was given a set of bracelets that cursed her and turned her away from the light of the Emperor. At first I was overjoyed by her newfound powers. She looked happy when she was able to move objects with her mind. She claimed that she would ask 2 invisible angels to please move things around the house, and they would happily oblige. The angels never existed. This was just her way of rationalizing that she was a psyker. But then she started doing weird things, like when she explained that one of the angels really loved sugar cubes, so she would leave them out for it to eat in the middle of the night. It was strange, but the reality was that the sugar cubes would be gone every morning. She started to tell me that the angels would tell her of future events, that they would tell her what would happen depending on what choices she would make that day. She even was able to save poor little Daphne from falling down a well. Her angels were guiding her, and she trusted them. Just like me, of course. No one believed her when she started telling others of her angels. I told her to stop talking about things like that to people around the town. People were starting to whisper that she was going crazy. Then one day, right after Saturday's sermon, she questioned the priest as to why he didn't have any angels of his own, if he was supposedly so close to the emperor. That's when things really turned for the worst. The priest called his colleagues from the Departamental Ministorum, and they told the archbishop of my wife's supposed powers. And before we knew it, the whole town was told not to communicate with us until the bishop himself talked to her. My wife didn't care that the townspeople would run every time they would see us coming down the road. She said all she needed was me and her angels. When the bishop showed up in town, he arranged an interview with both of us. 2 minutes into the interview, and the bishop's eyes began to bleed. He was so frightened, he ran out of the town hall. He was screaming, "Witch!" Of course I wanted to protect her, but I couldn't. I watched as they took her away and hung her in the town courtyard. Even though the priest and the bishop said she was possessed by chaos, she was still my wife. I lost the woman I loved. Life was never really the same after her death. I was always treated different by the townspeople, and no one would purchase anything from me. They were scared that my crops were tainted by chaos. I asked the priest for help when I didn't have enough thrones to pay for lumber in the fall. He turned me away. I had to sell our house and move in with relatives in the city. It was cramped living. My cousin could only spare a small room with no windows in one of his rental properties, but it was all I could afford. I became a janitor at a ministorum building and moved my way up to the mailroom within a year. Exactly 2 years after my wife's death, I received a letter at work. The sender was noted as Angels, and the note inside was from my wife. She spoke to me as if she was still alive and back at our country home. She explained how she missed me and how it's been hard not being able to be with me since I left. I crumbled the letter up and threw it in the garbage. Whomever was doing this was a cruel and evil-spirited person. I was glad I was out of that town and away from all those shitty townspeople that probably sent this letter. The following week, I received another letter. It came from the same person, but didn't even bother opening it. What was strange is that I felt like someone was watching me, waiting to see the expression on my face upon opening the letter. I doubted anyone was really watching. Another week passed, and another letter came. This time it was stamped as urgent. I reluctantly opened the letter, and it was her again. As I began to read the letter, it explained how my wife's angel had told her I was crumpling up the letters without reading them. A cold shiver went down my spine. At that moment, I knew someone was watching me. I didn't finish reading the letter. I simply folded it up and put it in my back pocket. The rest of the day, I made sure to keep an eye on everyone. I had to be sure I wasn't being watched by some prankster or malintent former townsperson. When I got back home, I locked myself in my small room and finished reading the letter. My dead wife was asking me to come back home. She said I didn't have to worry about the priest and the townspeople. She would take care of them. She said she missed me and she would be waiting for me back home. I burned the letter. Whatever this was, it was torment. I saw my wife die with my own 2 eyes, and every letter made me relive that day. I had to remind myself that she was truly dead, and there was nothing I could do to get her back, no matter what hope these letters provided. A week later, I was sorting through the mail, hoping not to see another letter from her. And there it was. I didn't open it at all. I simply placed it in my pocket and went back to work. When I got home again, I locked myself in my room and began to read. The letter pleaded me to come back home. My wife said she didn't understand why I would burn her last letter. She wanted to be with me again. I stood in my room in silence, staring at the letter. I was not alone. The feeling of being watched was not my imagination. My wife's angels were in the room with me. At that moment, I made the decision to go visit my old home. After a long journey, I arrived, and I stood there in front of the door of what was once our home. I knocked, but there was no answer. I knew there were people living at the home because I sold it to a man with a family of 6. I was surprised not a single child or even animal came running out. I stepped around the back and noticed that the door was wide open. I knocked again, but went inside. Things were very dusty, as if no one had been living here for quite some time. There was a sound coming from the basement, but the light switch was not turning on the light from upstairs. I walked down the dark stairs, and even though I had done this thousands of times when I lived here, never had I felt this much fear going down in the basement. I took a few steps out, waiting for my eyes to adjust, when I stepped on something that cracked. When I looked down, I was horrified to make out the skeletal remains of a child's leg, its little shoes still on the toddler's feet. I ran towards the steps, but I felt a strong tug on my shirt. I looked back, and deep in the basement, I could make out the silhouette of a dark figure with long hair. It walked towards me, and try as I might, I could not run away. I was being pushed back by some invisible force. When the figure was finally close enough to see, I realized it was my wife. She was as beautiful as the day I first met her. She appeared younger and radiant. She stretched out her arms, and I hugged her as tight as I could. She explained that before her death, her angels went out and pleaded to their master to save her life. While she was gasping for air in the town square on the day of her hanging, all she could think of is the fear of never seeing me again. She was visited by a beautiful goddess who promised to save her so long as she was willing to follow her teachings. My wife accepted the offer and was resurrected on the 300th day after her hanging. But her body was horribly decayed, and the goddess explained to her that she would have to bathe in a mixture of milk and blood. The younger the blood, the more beautiful she would appear. She explained that she no longer had to eat, drink, or sleep. Her body remained pure for 6 days. After the 6th day, she had to bathe again. She explained she had sustained herself by bathing in the blood of the family who lived in our house. But now that they were gone, she needed my help to find new people. There was no way I could do what she was asking me, but if I refused, she explained she would die. She reminded me of how much I hated the townspeople and how they basically drove me out of town, and it was true. And my love for my wife was much stronger than my feeling towards those people that watched as she was taken from me. That's when I realized I was willing to sacrifice every person on this planet so long as she stayed with me for the rest of my life. She was overjoyed and told me she would get help from her angel whenever possible. The first person we sacrificed was my neighbor, Old Nam. She lived alone, so the whole thing went over pretty easily. All my wife had to do is have her angel unlock the side door. But it was strange, because my wife always talked about 2 angels when she was alive, but now she only ever mentioned 1. When I asked her what happened to the second angel, she smiled and said she didn't know. It just left and never came back. I also started noticing that she would eat sugar cubes, and it was strange because she specifically told me that she no longer had to eat or drink. When I asked her about it, she just said she liked them a lot. The idea that this woman was not my wife, but a demonic imposter that was the cause of her death, it ate at my mind. But every time I took another body to her, she filled me with a sense of pleasure that I had never felt before. I was falling deeper in love with this woman.
And that was the wife. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. More creepypastas to come, more towards the end of the month. There's a couple well, I shouldn't say anything. There's creepypastas coming, and expect them towards probably the last week of October. I hope you guys are enjoying our content. If you guys want to support us, link in the description. That leads you to our Patreon. It's $1 a month. It is because of Patreon that we can do this kind of separate stuff with the creepypastas and different type of videos that aren't just the traditional 40 facts and the Greater Wall episodes. So thank you guys, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. This was Gersh1 with One Mind Syndicate signing out.
Always used to put my freedom